begin with the General, John de Chastelain.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I would start by saying that I'm not sure whether these statues were put here to make me feel at home, but they do. And I would go on by telling you that I joined the Canadian Army Reserve as a private in 1956, in January 1956. And I retired as a general in December 1995. And every time I was promoted to the next rank, the thought went through my mind, geez, I wonder if these guys know what they're doing. And I'm not sure if I know who these guys were or if they knew what they were doing. But last fall, when Moses sent me an invitation, he said, would you like to take part in Idea City? And I said, sure. I didn't know what Idea City was. And then he sent me the formal invitation with a list of the other people who were invited. And the thought went through my mind, in inviting me, does he know what he's doing? And the answer is, of course he doesn't, and he's about to find out. But I would say how honored I am to be amongst such a distinguished group of people. And if you wonder what I'm talking about, you have only to look at the next two speakers or three speakers. And those of you who were here yesterday would know the same thing too. I'm going to sit while I make this presentation, and I would also tell you at the outset that in the infantry, the first thing you learn is that a moving target is hard to hit. So I should be up and pacing. But I'm going to sit for a couple of reasons. One, I like sitting. And two, I'm going to give you a shot at me. And if you really want to have it easy, a sitting target's easy to hit. And the third issue, as Moses said, was it was a late night last night, an early morning this morning, and I can give your eyeballs a rest if I stay motionless. When I was invited, I wasn't sure what I should talk about. That has never stopped me in the past for talking anyway, and I'm going to do that. But I had the impression that since my most recent activity for the last 7 years has been in Northern Ireland, I should talk about Northern Ireland. And I'm going to do that. But before I do that, I want to pick up a point that Michael Ignatieff raised yesterday, and that is about the need for combat effectiveness in the Canadian Forces. And you might say, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? He's a soldier. And the answer is, yeah, I would, and probably for that reason. But I, too, am concerned about the combat effectiveness and the way the Canadian Forces are going, simply because I believe that a country like Canada deserves good armed forces. Any country that is a country is worth fighting for, and Canada sure is. I would tell you also that I never started out to be a soldier. When I was finishing school in Scotland in 1955, about to do my 2 years national service and then go to Oxford, I had plans to become a great novelist when I finished, or a great painter when I finished. And if those didn't work, I'd learned to play the bagpipes, and I had figured I could carve out a spot in the street, in the high street, and put down a sign saying, pay or I'll play, and I wouldn't starve. But instead, I came to Canada, joined my parents who'd moved here. My father's company moved him here. And I went to RMC. And the reason I went to RMC was twofold. One, with the sense of guilt that I skipped out on my military service when friends of mine who had been in the same school were serving, fighting the communists in Malaya, or the Ayoka in Cyprus, or the Mau Mau in Kenya. And two, a sense of guilt that my parents had put me through 12 years of boarding school at their expense, and that maybe I should do something about paying it back. And RMC allowed me to get an education, a degree, paid for by them, and a commission, in return for which I would then serve for 3 years. And 3 years was only 1 year longer than the two. And then I'd get out and write the great Canadian novel, or give Robert Bateman a run for his money, or if not, pick up my place on Spark Street in Elgin and put out my sign and play the bagpipes. But instead, I stayed in the Army. And the reason I did was that I enjoyed it. I felt it was challenging. It was great to be a part of a history of an armed force in a nation that had become a nation at Vimy Ridge, that had become even more of a nation after the Sicily landings at Dieppe, Normandy, the liberation of Holland, a navy that by the end of the war was the third largest in the world and kept open the sea lines in the North Atlantic and to Murmansk, an air force that had taken part in the Battle of Britain, Bomber Command, and had provided the largest air training program in the world. And it was clear why there was a need for an armed force at that time. I still think there is today, but then it was clear. I went to RMC in 1956, at the time of the Hungarian invasion by the Soviet Union, the Suez Crisis. 6 years later, I was a captain in Ottawa, telling the Chief of General Staff he had 1 hour's notice to go to the bunker in Carp, because the Cuban Missile Crisis was reaching the point where the government felt that nuclear war was imminent. Another 6 years later, I was in Cyprus commanding a company trying to keep two NATO allies apart when Czechoslovakia was invaded by the Soviet Union. And in 1980, I was commanding the Mechanized Brigade Group in Germany when Poland declared martial law and NATO notched DEFCON up another level. So it was quite clear to us why we needed armed forces in those days. And in the aftermath of the Cold War and the reduction of the armed forces, it may seem to a lot, government and the population, that the need is no longer there. But as Michael said yesterday, a lot of bad guys out there still. We fought them in the Gulf War, we've been involved in Afghanistan, we've been in the Balkans, we've been in East Timor, we've been in Haiti. And it's not that the men and women of the armed forces today are any less dedicated, any less well-trained, any less well-motivated, they're more well-educated. It's simply that they don't get the resources they need for the task they're doing. And I worry particularly about the lack of training at the formation level, that we're going to be able to fulfill our commitments in the future. So that's all I'll say about that. Except to add a by-note that when the Cold War was ending, I went to the countries of the Warsaw Pact to work out how we would deal with the end of the Cold War. And in 1990, I went to Budapest. I happened to have my bagpipes with me, and that's another story, but have bagpipes will travel. And when I met with General Borshitz and the Hungarian General Staff, the Canadian ambassador gave a party, and he said, would you play the pipes? And so I did. Hungarian General Staff were a bit surprised, but I played the pipe. Then we went to Moscow, and I met with General Moiseev and the Soviet General Staff, and the acting ambassador said, I'm going to give a party, would you play the pipes? So I did, and played the pipes to the Soviet General Staff, and the Warsaw Pact dissolved. And a few weeks later, I was at NATO headquarters in Brussels for a meeting of the military committee with my fellow chiefs of defense, and I was chatting with a group that included the American Chief of Defense, Colin Powell, and the German Chief of Defense, Klaus Naumann, and the Danish Chief of Defense, Jürgen Long. And they said, how'd it go? And I said, well, I played the bagpipes in Budapest, and I played the bagpipes in Moscow, and the Warsaw Pact collapsed. And they said, well, for God's sake, don't play them around us. It is difficult in a short space of time to talk about the circumstances of Northern Ireland, but what I'll try and do is talk about what the peace process was, what the role of decommissioning in it was, and more particularly why the headlines yesterday and today say that the process is in crisis. And I also want to say something about the large number of Canadians who are involved in the peace process that you may not know about, very distinguished individuals who are playing an important part in it. The peace process in its current form started in 1994 when the IRA declared ceasefires, and then the loyalist paramilitary groups, the Ulster Volunteer Force and the Ulster Freedom Fighters, followed suit. And the intention was to put in place a circumstance in which political talks, could address three issues. One was putting a new government back into Northern Ireland. There had been one there until 1972 when it was removed during the Troubles and Westminster imposed direct rule. But this time the government had to be an inclusive one. Inclusive in the sense that Catholics, Republicans, and nationalists would be included on a per capita basis, which had not been the case in the previous Stormont government. And the second issue to be looked at was to set up north-south bodies between the Republic of Ireland and the north, with ministers from each, in areas of common concern like transport and communications and tourism and so forth. And the third issue was to put in place relations between London and Dublin and the component parts of Great Britain and Ireland to get over the kind of difficulties that had occurred between the two since partition in 1920 and since the formation of the Irish Free State and then the Irish Republic. And those talks didn't get started right away because of the issue of decommissioning of paramilitary arms. The Unionist parties insisted that in a democratic society there could be no private armies, and they wouldn't sit at the table with political parties who were related or had connections with paramilitary groups that had arms and who might use recourse to arms if they didn't get their way at the table. And it wasn't until after an international body that I was on with Senator George Mitchell and the former Prime Minister of Finland, Harry Hokuri, had made recommendations on decommissioning that the talk started, and we were invited back to chair the North-South talks that involved both governments. And those talks, even though they started, didn't get into issues of substance, again because of decommissioning. Unionists insisted that while they'd agreed to sit at the table without decommissioning being addressed, they wanted it addressed first thing on the agenda. In a democratic society, no private armies. the one nationalist party there, the Social Democratic Labour Party, Sinn Féin had been excluded because the IRA had broken the ceasefire in January of 1996, said, yeah, decommissioning is important, but this is about politics. This is about putting in place the kind of circumstances in which there'll be no need for guns in Irish politics and they can then disappear. So let's deal with the politics first, put in place the circumstances in which decommissioning will occur as a byproduct, and we'll get on with it. And there was no agreement for over a year. And it wasn't until 1997, after a second IRA ceasefire and after two new governments had come in, Tony Blair in Britain and Bertie Ahern in Ireland, that they called the talks together again, finessed the issue of decommissioning by creating a commission on decommissioning, which I would chair, with a Finnish representative and an American representative, and left to us the issue of dealing with decommissioning while the political talks went on with the real issues, which is what happened and led to the Good Friday Agreement or the Belfast Agreement of 1998. And that agreement, amongst other things, set up an executive with inclusive executive with devolved powers from Westminster, with nationalist, Republican, unionist, and loyalist members, with the First Minister being a unionist and the Deputy First Minister being a nationalist. But they didn't actually get together, again, because of decommissioning. Again, the unionists insisted that before they would agree to sit in an executive, decommissioning had to have started, and it didn't start. The IRA refused to name a point of contact with the Commission. The UFF did likewise. The Ulster Volunteer Force did, but they weren't going to move on decommissioning until they knew what the IRA was going to do. And again, we went into a period of stasis in which nothing was happening. But the Good Friday Agreement did call for, in addition to the political bodies being set up, decommissioning to be completed in 2 years by May of 2000, prisoners to be released who had been arrested for crimes that were related to the political process, a police commission to be set up to revise the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which was 93% Protestant, and come up with a police force that was more representative of the whole community. The British Army to start reducing its 22,000 troops and its various strong points, and a number of issues dealing with human rights. And it became evident, at least to me, why we were having the kind of difficulty we were having, even though the agreement was universally accepted as being the right way to go. 93% of the population of Ireland accepted it, in spite of the fact that Ireland changed its constitution, did away with Articles 2 and 3 that laid claim to Northern Ireland, in spite of the fact that Britain repealed the Government of Ireland Act of 1920, which laid claim to Northern Ireland, and both governments made it clear that the principle of consent would apply. That is, that if the majority of Northern Ireland wanted to become part of the Republic, Britain wouldn't stand in the way, and if the majority of Northern Ireland wanted to stay in the Union, Ireland wouldn't object. But I was in West Belfast a couple of years ago talking to a lady who had grown up in the part of West Belfast where the Troubles first started, when Loyalists attacked Catholics. And she thanked me for my part in the process and said, we think the Good Friday Agreement's a wonderful piece of work, but we certainly hope the IRA don't give you their guns. And I said, why is that? And she said, well, who would protect us then? And I was about to say the police would, but then I knew what kind of answer I'd get. And a short while later, I was in South Fermanagh on the border talking to a Protestant farming family that had been there for years and who, prior to the ceasefires, had been attacked by the IRA, but felt reasonably secure because there was a British infantry installation, strong point, only a few hundred yards away. And under the demilitarization process, that had been vacated. And their question to me was, who's going to protect us now? So that even in spite of the universal acceptance that the Good Friday Agreement was a great piece of work, the feeling was that in my particular case, it doesn't necessarily concern me. The beauty of the Good Friday Agreement was it was imprecise on a number of issues. If it had been totally precise, there wouldn't have been an agreement. And that very fact made its implementation difficult. George Mitchell said at the time, it's been hard to get this agreement, it's going to be twice as hard to get it implemented. And with a number of ups and downs over a period of 3 or 4 years, we missed the target of May of 2000 to complete decommissioning. Really, it hadn't started. We missed the target, the second target of June of last year. In October of last year, the IRA, having made contact with the Commission, having appointed a representative, and the Ulster Freedom Fighters did likewise, did indeed carry out an act of decommissioning, which was historic in that it happened, but because it was not transparent, as was allowed by the regulations and the laws, although we knew what had happened because we had witnessed it, taken an inventory of the arms for eventual release to the governments, those who wanted to see the proof were concerned. And today, the reason for the announcement that the process is in crisis is that there is still a concern that after nearly 5 years, or over 4 years, There has been very little progress on decommissioning. A second IRA event in April of this year, none on the part of the loyalist forces who say they still want to believe that the IRA is sincere. Because of that lack of progress there, because of an incomplete support for the new policing process, Sinn Féin has not accepted it, the unionists wonder if this is in fact not a tactical ploy and want the process reviewed, or are suggesting that the process may have to be reviewed. There was also concern that 3 Republicans were arrested in Colombia last year, believed to have been involved with the paramilitary group, the FARC, and that this is evidence that the IRA is not sincere about what they're doing. I have no reason to believe that that is the case. I deal with the representative who tells me that it is not, and I take what he says for granted. I would tell you that Canada has been very supportive of this whole process. The Canadian government, the Prime Minister personally, has put his support behind it. We contribute to the International Fund for Ireland. Professor Shearing from the University of Toronto was a member of the Patent Commission on Policing. Assistant Chief Constable Al Hutchinson, also from Toronto, the RCMP, retired now, is the Chief of Staff of the Police Implementation Board in Belfast. Chief Justice Bill Hoyt of the Court of New Brunswick is one of the 3 judges looking into the Bloody Sunday inquiry. And more recently, Peter Corrie, a former Chief Justice of Canada, is looking into the political assassinations on both sides of the traditional divide. And I have been assisted by 2 members of the Foreign Affairs Department over the past nearly 7 years, David Angel and Clifford Garrard. So Canada is doing a great deal for it, and this is not too surprising because, as you will know, there are many Canadians of Irish origin, or Canadians who have families in Ireland still. Yeah, I'm asked frequently, am I optimistic? And the answer is yes, I have to be optimistic. I think there is so much involved and so many people want this to happen. Even those who have suffered and who are bereaved, even those who are having members of their families killed as recently as last week and the week before, and who insist that there should be no retaliation and that it is too important for this process to be lost. So is it going to work? I don't know. Ask me to prove it and I can't. But I think it will, and I hope it will, and I pray that it will. And thank you for listening to me.